Now, I don't point all this out for mere interest. These are other voices that we're hearing in the debate, and they're very important voices because of the challenges that they pose for those who are proposing IG models. Perhaps the most important question they pose is around the question of the missional nature of the church and whether or not intergenerationality is appropriate for a missional church. This is an absolutely central question that we're going to spend a little bit of time on now. So Ward and Cray, and the people on that left-hand side of the diagram, they'll be arguing that the shape of the church ought to be driven by the mission of the church, and the mission of the church will be driven by the context the church finds itself in. So the context is all important. That dictates the shape of the church because the church is missional. So if the context demands age separation, then that is what the church should do. That's the missionally appropriate thing to do. God is missional, we should be missional in terms of the context, and therefore that's what we should do. Others as well go a bit further than that and say, if we understand that our context to be consumerist, people choosing what they want to do, we have no choice but to address consumerism in our mission. Okay, it's part and parcel of our society. We need to go with that. We are in the world after all. And if people want an age-specific offering, then that's what we need to provide, especially in the area of music and other cultural products like that. Now, of course, all this runs somewhat counter to the authors we were talking about before, Harkness and Ketchum and people like that. They were clearly suggesting that the church is essentially all age. It's not an option, it's not something we choose, it is. It's something about what the church is. Now, if this feels like a little bit of an unresolvable puzzle, then you're not alone. We're just going to spend 2 minutes just teasing it out with the help of two people called Mount Stephen and Martin, who wrote a Grove booklet called The Body Beautiful, which in my view is one of the most helpful pieces on intergenerational church, although they don't actually use that term because they're writing in 2004 before that kind of language was used. Now they write this, which kind of captures this problem that we face in intergenerational church and mission. Okay. There's an irresolvable tension between the twin imperatives upon the church of being both an all-age community standing out from the fragmentation of society and being a community taking shape within a culture. So they're recognising the tension is there. If you want to use Pauline language for that, if you think in the New Testament, there is that idea that the church is one. There's no slave or free, no male or female, and we add in no old or young or black and white. And yet Paul also says, in mission, I'll be a Jew to the Jew and a Greek to the Greeks. How do we bring those twin imperatives together? We want to take the mission of the church and the nature and essence of the church very seriously. Mount Stephen and Martin helpfully tease out that tension for us, and I recommend that Grove booklet to you. Now they begin to explore a way out of this by thinking about the Trinity, and this is where things take a really interesting turn. So they argue that yes, God is missional, and so we ought to be missional too. But they say at the same time, God is also in himself a community of difference, and so to be an effective witness in society, the church needs to be a community of difference as well, and we should expect that to be the case. So they write, the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, will inevitably create community after the likeness of the community of the Trinity. And by that, they mean differentiated relationship. Why? Well, here's their next quote. Because the Trinity is not an homogeneous unit. What we may expect to find in the community which the Spirit creates are the very hallmarks of the Holy Trinity. Not homogeneity, but diversity, interdependence, mutuality, complementarity, and all that's implied by the idea of perichoresis. That's a flash word for the relationship between the persons of the Trinity. Those are the very hallmarks, they say, in fact, of the all-age church. Now, the highly significant thing that Mount Stephen and Martin have done here is they've placed the essence of the church right at the centre of the mission of the church, concluding, and here's their conclusion, that the call of the church is to model reconciled community, not as a displacement activity to avoid the real task of mission, but because reconciliation lies at the very heart of mission. Now, it's very interesting to see that the Grove series on evangelism has just released a new booklet, and that's about the significance of community in mission. and Philip Mount-Stephen has co-authored that one as well. And that booklet asks this question: is community a forgotten factor in mission? Is community a forgotten factor in mission? I'll leave you to read the booklet and answer the question, but it's clear that the authors think that it is. And more authors are bringing this idea of community as central to the church, including in its mission, up more and more. A very interesting piece, if you want to read further, is The Faith of Generation Y by Sylvia Collins-Mayer and others, which makes a very interesting read and argues from this space of community. Now, it's interesting at this point to pause and take that issue of community and use that as a way in to consider the historical situation that we face. Why are we talking about this now? Why is it that this wasn't an issue 100 years ago? Why is it that youth and children's ministry was separated in the past, is still separated? What's the historical roots of all that? Now, I know history is not everyone's cup of tea, but it's really important, isn't it, that we understand where we are and how we've got there if we want to understand how we might move on. Now, it is possible, isn't it, that we might be tempted to think that it's all about consumerism and individualism. Those are the culprits I often hear, and people talk about life from the 1960s onwards as being the real problem. But I want to take us a little bit further back than that. I think the story begins a long time ago, 200-300 years ago, finds its roots in the Industrial Revolution, the urbanisation of society, the Enlightenment and the Reformation. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but just think, by the 19th century, a huge change has happened, hasn't it? Yeah, people have moved, massive population movements into the urban areas. Men started working outside the home in factories. There's increasing wealth and the need to secure a workforce for a modern economy, which leads to the free state school developments around the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. So what you have there is, instead of work and child rearing and healthcare and education all happening under one roof, with extended family providing some of those things, work then goes on in the factory, education then goes on in the schools, and in each of those areas, an expert is responsible for those things. So you have separation, segregation, and professionalisation. This has a profound impact on society, and as we'll see, the church begins to mirror it, which in some sense is completely understandable. In schools in particular, what we see, of course, is an increasing segmentation by age as that state school system develops. Might have at first been simply a way of organising people, but increasingly as educational philosophies like Piaget and the like get hold of the school system, it becomes a theory that drives separation and segregation within the state school system. I'm not arguing that all these things are bad, but this is where we're at. This is the background to why we're having the conversation today, in a way. Now, perhaps ironically, what begins as an attempt to help children become those productive adults that a modern economy and society needs, that process, in some senses, had the reverse effect, as it actually fostered and helped to create as a catalyst for the development of youth culture, which, as we see today, is extending adolescence into the early 20s. So Thomas Bergler has a very astute observation where he says this: crowded together in age-segregated environments to learn how to be productive adults, young people instead began to create their own language, values and styles, which sociologist Talcott Parsons would soon label youth culture. Now, of course, what you can do is you can map the development of the Sunday school movement and parachurch organisations, take Urban Saints now, what's Crusaders, and in America, other organisations. You can map those onto that historical development quite clearly. The Sunday school movement obviously started before the development of schools, but it maps onto the modern development of a modern economy and urbanised society. And then the parachurch organisations, if you take their founding date, you'll find them all developing and being founded at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. What then happens is the church begins to see the development of the parachurch organisations, starts to mirror what they're doing because they're very successful, starts to take on youth workers throughout the middle of and to the end of the 20th century, and we begin to see that we get to where we are. Now, we've only just begun to scratch the surface of that, and IG writers provide a lot of background on that history because they do see it as very important to explain our current situation. But so you can see how that social and economic background begins to eat away at the sense of community. And that sense of community across the ages, that is the soup in which we grow up and exist. Fragmentation, asegmentation is steadily weaved into the fabric of society, and the church follows suit and mirrors it. Now, with the dawning of what some people call postmodernity since the 1970s onwards, some people are saying, well, yeah, do you know that's been intensified, hasn't it? And there's truth in that, isn't there? With the dawning of television and then the internet and then now mobile technologies, we are witnessing an increased fragmentation. That's not getting slower, that's getting faster, that's getting more intense, isn't it? More fragmentation and segmentation in the social world. But here's the interesting bit, and this gives us pause for thought. Several writers are now beginning to ponder whether what we're witnessing really is a renewed interest amongst emerging generations with the idea of community. Possibly because everything's so fragmented, they're seeking out new ways of expressing community. And also that means that perhaps those age-segmented approaches to mission amongst youth and children that were developed in the 19th and 20th centuries are not necessarily the best models for the 21st century. You may be aware that Google have just announced that they think this new generation that is emerging now is called Generation C. And the reason for that is there are 4 traits that all begin with C that help us to understand this generation's attitude to life. 2 of them are these: creators and community. Generation C want to be creators and they want to be in community. Now that's extremely interesting and important for people who are thinking about IG. It's extremely interesting and important because, as we've already seen, with its focus on mutually influential relationships and interaction and co-creation, bi-directional teaching, all those things of community and people as creators are at the absolute heart of intergenerational church. So once you move from a multi-generational to an intergenerational form of ministry, you see quite clearly and quite quickly that what happens by definition is that people move from being consumers to being creators. And this is why I laboured the point about the difference between multi and intergenerationality. When you move from multi-generationality to intergenerationality, you are by definition allowing people into the process of creating and contributing to the event or the practice or the service or whatever it is. You're allowing them to become co-creators in that. Now that throws up all sorts of questions about authority in the church, what it means to be a leader in the church. We don't have time to touch on those now, but there's plenty of time, I'm sure, in this conference and thereafter. Now all this means that it's possible that increasingly in the 21st century, we're going to find that not only do IG models kind of feel right, biblically, theologically, and from learning theory and all those sorts of things, they may also prove to become a culturally relevant form of mission where hitherto they haven't felt like that. Meaning that that irresolvable tension that Mount Stephen and Martin talked about back in 2004 may actually be last century's problem. Of course, there are still those whose hearts sink, aren't there, at the thought of having to engage with youth and children rather than see them shipped off to the professional youth worker who really knows how to address their needs and their questions, leaving everyone else in peace. That's still there now, isn't it? And that's why conferences like this exist. And so I hope the rest of the day is going to be instructive in taking some of these ideas forward with the case studies and the details you're going to receive. There are undoubtedly also significant challenges, aren't there, that we face to build in IG relationships into our faith communities. Now, I would want to spend the last few minutes just thinking about a theology which might help us when we're thinking about how to implement IG. So I'm not going straight into practice here, but I am going to talk about a certain doctrine, a certain theology, which might help us when we're thinking about implementation. I think there is a little bit of a risk that we move too quickly to practice and implementation without thinking of what theological resources there are that might help us with some of these changes that we want to bring about. The theology, or the doctrine I want to talk about, is the doctrine of accommodation. Now that doctrine, put simply, means that God, as infinite and completely other from us and sinless, cannot make himself known to us unless he comes down to us, unless he takes the initiative to make himself understandable to us. That's in a nutshell what the doctrine of accommodation says. Now this theology can be traced right back to the early church, but here's a quote from Calvin that helps us understand. It gives us a picture of what this doctrine is actually talking about. So Calvin says that when God speaks, such forms of speaking do not so much express clearly what God is like as accommodate the knowledge of him to our slight capacity. To do this, he must descend far beneath his loftiness. So because God is other from us and because of our sin, God has to come down to us to explain himself, make himself understandable, to adapt himself to our slight capacity. Now, when you review this doctrine and look historically and look in the Bible, you'll see that God doesn't merely accommodate himself in word, but also in deed, in behaviour, how he relates to his people. He is an accommodatory God, not least in the incarnation, as Jesus comes to show us who God is. But interestingly, when we look at passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 8 to 11, we see this principle of accommodation as something that should inform how Christians should relate to each other. So it's not simply the way that God relates to us. It's an example that we're to follow, says Paul, as he follows Christ, of how we should relate to each other in the community of faith. And Paul in those chapters clearly lays out that those with authority and those with more knowledge of the faith ought to accommodate those without, or at least those with less authority and less knowledge. Now, I take that to mean that there has to be some extent in the process of the development of IG models in church that we give some thought to how we accommodate youth and children, how we adapt, how we change so that they can understand who God is. They, of course, by definition, have less authority and less knowledge. That's not to say that they're of a different value, that we don't learn from them, that all that stuff about bidirectional teaching still can be applied. But there has to be some way in which we understand that some people have authority and knowledge and need to adapt accordingly. Now, naturally, we've only scratched the surface of all of these issues, but I hope that I've helped to map out some of the main features of the IG landscape as you go in the rest of this day to look at some of the details and some of the case studies that you'll be thinking about. I hope that when we've talked about some of these things, you've understood more about the definitions of some of the terms that we've used, some of the core main arguments for IG, some of the big challenges that some people put back towards IG models, as well as some of the historical considerations that are really important to help us understand where we're at today and how we might move on, and also some of the practical theological possibilities by using doctrines like the doctrine of accommodation. Now, I hope and pray this helps you as you consider intergenerationality in your context and life. IG, intergenerationality, may or may not prove to be a fad that passes with time, or maybe the next thing that's grabbed to stem the tide of youth and children leaving the church, or even just a less resource-intensive way of catering for youth and children. But I hope not. I hope and pray that, in fact, this will be something that we all consider proactively for the right reasons as a biblically, theologically grounded model of ministry, but also one that fits really well with the emerging context of the 21st century that we find ourselves in. Thanks very much.